So, you think you like Occitanie, but how do you actually know you won't regret where you choose? That question sits underneath almost every call I have with people looking at the southwest of France, even when they don't quite like saying it out loud. Because on the surface, Occitanie feels like one of the safest bets in the country. You've got the sun without Riviera prices, culture without Paris pressure, and that space without total isolation. For a lot of people, it looks like the region where you can't really go wrong. And that's exactly why some people sometimes do. Not because Occitanie disappoints them, but because they underestimate how different life feels depending on which version of Occitanie they end up living inside. Now, before we go any further, quick pause. If you're already feeling that slightly foggy, there's way too much choice here feeling, we've put together a free Occitanie regional guide that walks through daily life, rhythms, trade-offs and realities across the region. And alongside that, our weekly newsletter goes deeper into what life actually feels like on the ground in the southwest of France week by week. Both are free, both are designed to give you texture rather than hype. Right. The promise Occitanie makes, whether it means to or not, is optionality. You can picture yourself near a big city like Toulouse or Montpellier, or somewhere smaller like Albi or Narbonne, or even further out in places deep into the Gers or the Lot, where life slows right down. Alternatively, you could be near the coast with the sea nearby, but still at arm's length from the mass tourism everyone's trying to run away from. On a map, it all looks compatible. But in real life, it isn't. Occitanie doesn't punish bad choices quickly. It does it slowly through small frictions that only really show up once the novelty has worn off. And the biggest friction point by far is something most people don't name clearly enough at the start. It's that balance between daily stimulation and calm. Not holidays, not summers, not when friends and family come to stay, just ordinary, forgettable days. So I often ask people to imagine a completely unremarkable Tuesday in February. It's cold, it's dark early, there's nothing planned. That day will tell you more about whether you'll be happy somewhere than any August afternoon ever will. So in Occitanie, those Tuesdays feel very different depending on where you are. If you're in a large, connected urban environment, daily life has momentum even in winter. In places like Toulouse, the city doesn't really go quiet. Restaurants stay open midweek, cultural life ticks along. There are talks, classes, concerts, exhibitions. You don't have to plan much for life to feel energy. It comes from being surrounded by people who are going somewhere. Montpellier has a similar effect, but with a different flavour, I guess. There's more youth, more movement, more sense of turnover. Even in winter, it feels active. Some people absolutely thrive on that. And others realise after a year or two that they love visiting that energy, but don't necessarily want to live inside it full time. And that's an important distinction. Regret here doesn't come from boredom, it comes from friction with pace. As you move away from the biggest hubs, daily life softens rather than stops. In places like Narbonne, Béziers, Perpignan, and to a certain degree Albi, a Tuesday in February still has life, but it's more contained. You notice patterns, familiar faces, a smaller number of places doing a lot of the social heavy lifting. For many people, this is the sweet spot. Enough going on to feel human and connected, but not so much that you feel swept along by it. These are the places where people often say, I didn't realize how much calmer my nervous system would feel, right? But they're also the places where regret can creep in if you unconsciously relied on variety before. If stimulation used to come from choice rather than depth, the narrowing can feel uncomfortable at first. Then, as you move further into the interior, deep into the Gers, parts of the Lot, the Tarn-et-Garonne, Ariège, Lozère, life becomes much more internally driven. On that same Tuesday in February, evenings are quieter. Some restaurants close midweek. Social life is real, but it's built through clubs, associations, neighbours, routines. If something is happening, it's because someone out there decided to make it happen. People who flourish here usually say things like, I love that my days aren't dictated by what's going on around me. People who struggle often say, I didn't realise how much I relied on things just happening. Neither reaction is right or wrong, but confusing the two at the decision stage is probably one of the most common sources of regret I see. Once you see Occitanie through this stimulation to calm continuum, the region starts to organize itself in a much more helpful way. You stop asking which town is best and start asking where your energy will come from when nothing special is happening. The second lens that quietly shapes long-term satisfaction is healthcare, but not in the dramatic emergency sense I think people often imagine. France's healthcare system is strong across Occitanie. Major hospitals in places like Toulouse, Montpellier, and Nîmes anchor the region really well. Even smaller departments have hospital coverage, of course, but regret rarely comes from the emergency care. It comes from the everyday friction. So finding a GP, getting appointments without months of delay, managing referrals and follow-ups without turning it into a part-time taxi job. In the larger hubs and their immediate surroundings, healthcare tends to fade into the background of life. You notice it less because access is easier and the systems are denser, I guess. In mid-sized town like Albi or Montauban, and to a greater extent, I guess, Perpignan and Narbonne, healthcare is still workable, but it starts to require a bit more planning. You may drive further for specialist help. You may wait longer. And again, in more rural and mountainous areas, the system still exists, but the burden shifts more heavily onto you. Appointments take organizing, distances matter more. Over time, that can either feel like a manageable trade-off or a quiet drain on energy. People who regret their choice here didn't misunderstand the quality of care. They underestimated how much logistics would matter to them as they aged. The third lens is access back to what you still think of as home, even if you're not planning to live there ever again. Very few people move to France expecting to feel cut off, but access has emotional weight that only becomes clearer over time. Family health issues, grandchildren, big life events, or simply the comfort of knowing you could easily get back if you needed to. Some parts of Occitanie forgive last-minute travel needs. Being near major train lines, airports, and transport corridors quietly reduces that stress. You don't think about access often, and that's exactly why it matters. Other areas turn travel into a project, still possible, still beautiful, but mentally heavy. For some people, that distance feels like freedom. For others, it creates a slight unease they didn't expect. So regret here doesn't come from the journey itself. It comes from realizing that access mattered way more than maybe you admitted at the start. Then there's the least romantic lens of all, but the one that protects you from sharp, expensive regret later on. And that's resale and exit flexibility. Nobody moves to Occitanie planning to sell again or anytime soon, but life rarely asks for permission, right? The real question isn't whether you'll sell, it's whether, if circumstances change, you'll still have choices. In places with deep, diversified demand where jobs, services, rentals, and population turnover actually exists, exits tend to be calmer and more predictable. But in places where demand is thinner and more lifestyle driven, exits can work beautifully until, I guess, they don't. Neither is wrong to buy into, but regret appears when someone buys something that only works for a very specific buyer, then realizes they value optionality more than they thought. Interestingly, most people who regret their purchase here don't regret the region, they regret the type of property they chose within it. Too niche, too large, too disconnected from everyday demand. Once you start layering these lenses together, the daily stimulation, healthcare friction, access, and exit flexibility, I think Occitanie will stop feeling overwhelming. Not because you suddenly know the answer, but because you start ruling things out calmly, not out of fear anymore on this, but just out of alignment with yourself and the life you want to live. That's usually the moment people feel relief rather than pressure. And it's also the moment regret becomes much less likely, or I hope anyway. If you're still unsure after watching this, that's not a problem. It's often a sign you're early in a healthy decision process. Most regret comes from premature certainty, from what I've seen anyway. The goal here isn't to pick a town today, right? It's to understand what kind of life you're actually choosing. That's why I'll say it again before we finish this. If you haven't already, check out our Occitanie regional guide and sign up to the weekly newsletter. They're both free and they're designed to give you repeated low pressure exposure to daily life across this region. So clarity builds naturally instead of being forced, right? Occitanie is a generous place that I used to call home and that I love, but it rewards honesty above all else. If you choose with your eyes open, regret tends to stay very quiet indeed. Thanks for watching.